In today's episode, we have a deep dive into boarding schools and the impact they can have on people's lives, from PTSD, addiction, workaholism, and emotional disconnection. And we explore the nature of anger, its potential effects, and the practical strategies for managing it effectively. Welcome to Man Questifying Meaning, where we help men navigate modern life, find their true purpose, and redefine manhood. I'm your host, James, and each week, inspiring guests share their journeys of overcoming fear, embracing vulnerability, and finding success. From experts to everyday heroes, get practical advice and powerful insights. Struggling with career, relationships, or personal growth? We've got you covered. Join us on Man Questify Meaning. Now, let's dive in. We can heal from trauma. We can move from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth. Good morning, peers. What do you mean by that statement?
Yeah, thank you. I think what I mean by that is in my own life, I thought I was just damaged and there was no way out. And it was that realization that I could heal and that there was a pathway. And I see that the work of Stephen Joseph talking about post-traumatic growth, that actually our wound can become our gift.
Okay, so it's kind of like you have all these things like anxiety and fear. Maybe say, for example, the fear of a snake.
Mm.
But that fear of a snake is almost a gift because that fear can almost become your friend, which then can teach you the lessons. Is that kind of right?
That's it. And then also, then we can help people who've been frightened of snakes go, well, this is what I did. And I think the wound becomes the gold. I mean, Robert Bly, in his book, Iron John, he said that our wound is where the greatest gift will be that we'll give back to society. At the end of Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, the psychiatrist, he says that often those people like Nelson Mandela, the Oprah Winfreys, have had real bad trauma in their lives, but they've turned it around and they've given their gift out. And I think that's what we're saying here, is that it can be growth rather than it just being, before we started recording, it's like taking us from -10, the trauma, to 0, but then from 0 to +10. Actually, I can be on purpose in life. I can give of my gift, whatever that might be.
It's almost like we have these things, anxiety, rejection, procrastination, but these things that we almost try to run away from, the more I feel is that you run away from it, the more it kind of chases you. But as soon as you allow yourself to hear what it wants to say, it's almost then it becomes your gift. So, for example, the other day, I've gone through a big phase, where I procrastinate, I get overwhelmed. But the other day, I decided to turn it around, and I asked myself, what does the overwhelm want to teach me?
Mm.
And it was kind of like, just kind of pull yourself back in. And it said, just focus on the one thing that you can do now, rather than trying to focus on this massive goal with all these different branches. And it's just said, focus on what you can do in this exact moment.
That's beautiful. That's it. Jason Selk, in his book Executive Toughness, he talks about this. He says, when we feel overwhelmed, what is the one thing I can do? Not the 10,000 things. No, what's the one thing that will make this better? And I think often in trauma, and what you've just said is fascinating. And I think I'd take it in another step, which is we have to feel it as well, because it's following us. But if we just stop and bring it somatically into the body, how does this actually feel? And often underneath that is the gold. It's the grief, but the flip side of the grief is joy. We run away. We don't want to feel the grief, but actually that's golden, because that opens our hearts. It gives us empathy for other people.
Can you tell me about yourself, please?
Yeah. So I work as a coach. I work mainly with leaders, executives, and the specialities around boarding school. So I help people who've been to boarding school, maybe they had a difficult time, or they are suffering the consequences now. There's often what we call boarding school syndrome, is a specific set of symptoms, addictions. We've got workaholism, struggle in intimacy, difficulty feeling emotions, depression, suicidal thoughts. These often accumulate, and people don't realize it's often linked into their experiences at boarding school. They just think, oh, that's just me. But actually, so that's my work. And I'm also a producer of a documentary called Boarding on Insanity, realizing that just how many of our global leaders have been to boarding school. Mark Zuckerberg, the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, who's just resigned, head of the Church of England, who's just resigned, Justin Welby, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, etc., etc., etc. So we're making a documentary to go, what's the impact of trauma on our leaders? Are our leaders traumatized? How might that impact the rest of the world? So that's something I'm doing. I run a podcast, but my day-to-day work is really working with leaders, executives, people who've been to boarding school or some form of trauma.
That brings to mind, and obviously I always try to avoid talking about politics or anything like that. But I remember Donald Trump, in one of his speeches, said, if you want to overcome depression, work harder. And I was like, oh my God, how can you say that kind of thing? And that just goes to show that the workaholism, the lack of idea of your own emotions, and probably the impact that could have on people who heard that.
Yeah, I think we do live in a very driven world. And, you know, it's like if you look at the brain, and this is the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, we have left and right hemispheres of the brain. One is more analytical and one is more intuitive, more inward. And we in the West, it's just the left side of the brain, analytical, more work, push, push, push. But this is more the feeling sense, the right side of the brain. It's more feeling, it's intuitive, it's creative. And I feel both need to be nurtured. And when we have both in balance, it's called hemi-syncing. And I just feel we're out of balance. You know, we see how we treat the earth. That shows me we're out of balance. We haven't gone within. We're always out, out, out. And actually, I feel great leadership, and this is what Warren Bennis, Cousins and Posner in their book Leadership Challenge says, is we've got to start going within. We've got to lead ourselves first.
There's an idea that's almost as well, it brings to mind the masculine and the feminine. So the masculine side of things is taking the action, doing the work. And then the female side, the feminine, not up to the female, the feminine, a sense of surrender. So it almost feels almost like hemi-syncing. So the action, as soon as you take an action step, surrender. Then take some more action and then surrender. And it's almost that sense of allowing ourselves to do what we need to do, but then flowing with the universe, or flowing with, if you use the word God, kind of thing.
Yeah, perfect. It's that. It's like if you look at martial arts, you know, I've done martial arts over a number of years, in particular Aikido, and the Japanese, and the idea is the more relaxed you are, and I've heard this of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well. They say the more relaxed you are, the better you are. People often think, oh no, if you're really strong and you're kind of rigid like that. Well, actually, that shows you're weaker, you're easier to submit. And so it is important for us to act, but in a relaxed way. Softness. And it's like, if you think of water, water will move through anything. It's, and that's a lot in martial arts, is that flowing. of energy.
So where did your journey with boarding school begin?
Yeah, so I went to boarding school from age 11 to just before my 18th birthday. So I was there for 7 years. And on the surface, was seen as a success. I was good at sports. I was captain of athletics, first 15 rugby, first 11 football, and I was in a rock band. And I left boarding school and went on to a top business school, international business school, France, worked in Paris, London. And then in my 20s, I started to have a breakdown. Within a few weeks, I'd lost my father, had got cancer, eventually died. I split up from my partner. I left my home, quit my job, and I was essentially homeless. And it was around that time that I suddenly realized that boarding school, there was an impact there. And I came across a book, The Synchronicities, went on retreat, and I suddenly had the understanding that boarding school had been horrific. I had so much anger, and I realized, I'd been sexually abused while I was there. One of my friends had committed suicide, and the school decided after, the friend had committed suicide that we needed to go and see the priest, and the priest sexually abused me, as he tried to do with other people as well. He just got out of prison recently. And so that was my experience, and that just started. So I was mid-20s, started to have a real breakdown, and I went to live in a Buddhist monastery, and I went just for 10 days. I just needed some time out, but ended up staying over 1,000 days, 3.5 years. I ordained as a novice monk, and I worked with a Jungian analyst. And it was like just processing a lot of what I'd been through as a child. Lots of tears. I tried to commit suicide, self-harmed, but I came out the other side. So that was my experience. And I see that my work, it's a bit like beginning with my own journey. And I'm like, okay, it's just me. And then realizing, actually, no, there's other people who've been through this experience as well at boarding school. There's lots of stories. And then I started to do some investigation. I started to read the books of, well-known ex-boarders, and you realize, oh my God, almost to a T, they've had, most of them, horrific times. And then the third part is, well, what's the impact on the rest of us? If these people have been to these schools, had horrific times, and you realize there's a lot of data out there that Peter Levine, in his work, he says the effects of unresolved trauma can be devastating. And therefore, if boarding school is a trauma, so many of our leaders have been traumatized, how is that going to affect their decision making? And that's really my work now, is working both with leaders, but also, creating this documentary, which will be out in the next couple of months.
So you talked about some of your traumas that you went through. How did you start to delve a bit deeper into these traumas so that you could kind of understand what happened so that you could grow from it?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not essentially when I started to look within was when I started to work doing one-to-one. I think for me, boarding school, it's a complex trauma, complex PTSD. We have PTSD. That's one thing which happens. CPTSD, complex PTSD, is when that thing happens over and over again. So for us at boarding school, we're being separated from home over and over again. So it means it's complex. So I began seeing therapists, but it didn't really work. It was only really when I began to work with this Jungian analyst, and I started to work with dreams and the unconscious. And I think that was my pathway into, because people could say to me, oh, you're a good person, or you're this, or that. I couldn't hear it. I was too dissociated. But to actually start writing my dreams down, it was my dreams speaking to me. And I was they were nightmares, night after night after night, me being killed, being all types of horrible things. And I then realized, oh my God, that's my inner world. My inner world is really troubled. So that's how I went deep, was through doing unconscious work, dream work. What I do with my clients now is I use what's called EFT, matrix reimprinting, which is a similar work. We're going into the unconscious. What's your unconscious saying? Because often when we are just doing talk therapy or we're just coaching, it's just the prefrontal cortex. But our trauma is stored in the amygdala, in the limbic system, the reptilian part of the brain. And when we work unconsciously, we access that. Whereas often just by talking, we're not accessing that part of the brain. That's why, for example, I know you work as a firefighter. Some people might have been in a fire, and then any instance of a fire or smell of smoke, their amygdala is going to go off, and it's going to keep going off until they look at that unconscious. And there are tools and processes that we can do, coming back to that question, that we can heal. And, you know, whether it's dream work, whether it's matrix reimprinting, whether it's other things, we can heal these traumas.
Was there any specific things, or like with the dream, was there a specific dream that kept repeating that just literally said, and it had an aha moment?
Not particularly. I mean, my Jungian analyst, she said to me, write your dreams down. So I would wake up every night 2 or 3 times and I write my dreams down. So I could be awake an hour or 2 in the night writing my dreams down. I'd do pages and pages of them. And the theme was there was a lot of violence in them. I was either being shot at, I was fighting, you know. And so it was just showing me how much anger I had inside. And I think when I was able to separate almost and see that angry part, then the tears started to come. I started to grieve. And I think that was the key for me. I think often, sometimes trauma, we hold on to it. We're too frightened of grieving. But when we do, that's when we can start letting it go. It feels overwhelming because especially if you've got complex PTSD and it feels like this reservoir of emotion, it feels, oh my God, if I let that out, that's going to swamp me. And so what we do is just lift the sluice gate up little bit by little bit of tears, release, little bit of tears. And then eventually we can dismantle that reservoir wall and it's just a beautiful flowing river. This is our emotion. And I see in Britain, we have a society which is stiff upper lip. We dam up those emotions. Boys don't cry. And actually, it's the research is now showing that to be emotionally intelligent, to be able to connect to your authenticity, your vulnerability, is a greater predictor of future success than academic performance.
With regards to your own anger, how was it that you kind of started to release? How did you release that anger of yours?
Well, not in a very positive way at the beginning in the monastery. I painted. So my therapist said to me, I'd like you to start painting. So I was painting. I think I was already painting, but then she says, I was just doing it black and white because I was doing Chinese calligraphy, Chinese brush painting. And I wanted to perfect doing it. And she said, what about some color? And I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for color. And she says, no, I really suggest using some color. As soon as I added in the color, and I would paint using cardboard or paper, but I'd use my hands. And I was able to move, like somatically connect into this anger, and I'd be able to paint this. And that for me was very transformative. I'd feel anger coming up and I would paint it. The not so skillful ways was I was actually physically beating myself. So I went to A&E 4 times, I think, for broken bones, arteries opened, breaking things, you know. And so that was another way I was dealing. I'd punch the wall because I just felt so much anger. And then I think as I moved on and left the monastery, so I'd been there, 3.5 years, and then I left, was then using exercise to channel it. to go swimming, cold water swimming in the sea, biking, but then also painting. I got a studio and I'd get these big 5-meter canvases or pieces of paper and I would, just paint, and a bit like Jackson Pollock, do that type of thing. And that was for me a really great channel for that. Another thing was music, writing. I did a lot of journaling in the monastery. Didn't sing, but we were chanting. So we'd chant every day in Pali. So, Yantan, Santan, we'd be chanting. So I was allowing the voice up as well. Those are some of the ways that I dealt with the anger, but there was so much. I was so angry. What had happened?
So I know from my own past experience, I've had to build up that anger in the past. And when I would go out drinking with friends, I'd have a bit too much. And that's when, I suppose, when I had the alcohol, I could no longer push the anger down. So the anger would come up, and the idea of getting aggressive, fighting, that kind of thing. But I'm interested, when you said that you channeled your anger when you did exercise, how did you personally channel that anger? Because I know I use exercise now and again as a way to channel my anger, but I'm most interested in how you did it.
Yeah, so I think it's to feel it in the body. So actually to feel, okay, I feel anger, and then move. It's like the somatic. I think it's that mindfulness is just to feel, okay, I feel some anger. There's a practice from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who's passed away now. But he says it's like we've got to walk back and forth, or you can do it running and just say the words. Breathing in, anger has arisen in me. Breathing out, I'm taking good care of this anger. Breathing in. And so we just do that. We run, but we feel it in the body. And often what happens is, I've used this example quite a few times, but a few years ago, bought a new carpet for downstairs, and I was emptying. We've got a coal fire, emptying the ashes. And as I was walking down the corridor to empty them outside, one of the embers, which was still hot, fell onto the carpet. And I was like, right, it's really hot. Took it outside, came back, big hole in my new carpet. I'd only had it the day, and I felt really angry. And I just did the practice, walked back and forth, felt the anger, felt it in my body. I burst into tears. What it took me back to is when I was about 3 or 4, I'd put a light on the carpet at home, and it burnt a hole in the carpet, and I'd been beaten for it. And that memory was stored in me. And so just by us feeling the anger, often under the anger is sadness or grief, or there's something there. And I think as, British, we don't go down into that depths, and that's where the gold is. That's where it becomes from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth.
But for myself, I kind of embody the warrior. And I allow the warrior, anybody listening, the warrior is one of the 4 male archetypes and represents anger. So I use the warrior to so I do CrossFit. So when I'm going hell for leather, I almost channel that warrior and I allow him to feel what I need to feel in that moment.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, the archetypes are just so powerful. It's like these aspects of ourselves. And I think a lot of us are in shadow, especially around the warrior. The warrior, he's very calm. He's kind of very present, very powerful. I think sometimes in Britain we think, I don't know, we have this anger seems okay almost, that we bottle it up and then we explode. I think if we can just keep connecting in with our anger, feeling it, but not letting it build so much that we just explode. I mean, I used to, before I went to the monastery, I was very much into football and Portsmouth. And Portsmouth is, was my football team. And I remember being on the terraces, and there was such a lot of aggression. And, I remember being sat one day outside a pub, and these people started throwing bottles at the people from the opposing fans. And I turned and I looked at the kids next to me, and they'd got blood pouring down their face. One of the bottles had smashed onto one of these kids. And I'm just like, what am I doing here? There was so much anger. And I feel for us, it's like important for us just to every day feel, what am I feeling? Oh, feel it in our body so it doesn't build and then explode, as is so often happens in certainly in Britain.
Yeah. So throughout this journey of healing, what challenges did you come up against?
I think the first 30 years were really difficult for me. I mean, till I really left the monastery, things started to settle. But the first 30 years I came up against so many. One was, mental health, depression, suicidal thoughts, and then I tried to slip my wrist a couple of times, contemplated when I was in London, working in the city, jumping off Waterloo Bridge, and struggle with addictions as well. I went to Africa kind of post my father dying after leaving the city, and I was there for a year, and I struggled with drink. Some nights I would drink all night and then go back to work. And because of the work I was doing, it was like, I gave myself permission to drink lots. And it was like, it's okay, it's work. There's been many challenges there, obviously friends dying, but mainly it's been my own mental health, really struggling with anger, struggling with hating myself, struggling in relationships as well, not really being able to love. That was one of the side effects of boarding school, shutting my heart down and my emotions, being in relationship, but not being able to open and have empathy or a love. So, there's been quite a few. Certainly those first 30 years. I mean, the monastic life was very difficult, really difficult. Some people say, you're really lucky. And it's like, yes, on one level, I was really lucky. I probably would have been sectioned, probably would have been put into a mental institution because I was so broken. But I had the support there. And I think that's part, one of your questions, you said, what's really helped. And I think is community. My wife has been amazing. Michelle has really helped me, but also community, having friends, having the monastics there. I think sometimes we have this belief we've got to do it on our own. And that's definitely something from boarding school. It's all, got to do it yourself. And actually it's community as much as anything. Yes, we've got to help ourselves and we've got to have support around us.
So, as well as community, is there any specific tools or strategies that you use yourself on a daily basis? I'm just thinking if there's anybody here listening and they might not have gone to boarding school, but they might be struggling. And I think if there's any tools or strategies that you use that could really help people out there.
Definitely. This is something I'm fascinated by is tools. How do we move from that 0 to +10? And I've just had a cold bath, cold bath. I've not had one for a little while, but they say that increases our dopamine levels by 2.5 times. It's been shown in research, really great way of getting over addictions. Other things, exercise. If you can get into that zone 2, which is, I won't go into details here, but essentially it's the aerobic zone rather than anaerobic zone. Those types of things, those are shown, the efficacy for that compared with antidepressants, it's as effective, using exercise. I use EFT with my clients, but also on myself, and that's tapping on the meridians, the acupuncture and acupressure points. And I found that transformative both with myself and with my clients. Meditation, wonderful for me. It's not for everyone. If we're really struggling mentally, sometimes meditation's not so good, but because we can go too much into our heads, but actually going out walking and being mindful. So almost mindfully walking. I think that's another one. Creativity, painting, drawing, writing, creating stories, allowing the little child part of you in to almost feel joy again. I think in society, we squash that joyful part. We become adults, but that part still lives within us. It needs to dance around. And dancing, there's a thing in the UK called 5 Rhythms, which is, without alcohol, we go and we dance with a community, and it's found that to been really transformative. What other things have I found really great? Qigong, Tai Chi, martial arts. I think practices for getting us into our bodies. And, something like EFT, you can find videos. I have videos on YouTube where I lead people through the different processes. And I've interviewed a few people on my podcast, about the science behind EFT. And I'm trying to think what other ones. Yoga, that's another one. Being barefoot on the earth, grounding, earthing, I've mentioned cold water. But all of these things, diet makes a big difference, as the work of Christopher Palmer, brain energy, psychiatrist, founding actually if we change our diets, that improves our mental health. There's just so much out there. And I think it's wonderful now that there's so much clinical data to go, wow, actually, if you cut down your carbs, that makes a real difference to how you feel. According to Christopher Palmer or Georgia Reed. It's like, wow, all of these things. So
yeah, I can relate to a few of them. So I've done cold baths in the past, and I ought to get back to really cold showers. But I find the cold shower for me, it helps me to slow down my breathing.
Mm.
So when you get into a cold bath, and obviously in the winter it's colder than in the summer, but it's the idea that you become present. You become present in that moment because you're freezing cold. In the first 10 seconds, you go, no, but within 10 seconds, I've learned to slow my breathing down quite rapidly. And that massively helps because it has an idea of really waking you up first thing in the morning. So with regards to other men that you've seen who have gone to boarding school and have this post-traumatic stress, what are the reoccurring themes that you see in men of this?
Yeah, I've mentioned them before. I think it's addictions, either cocaine or alcohol or pornography or having affairs with people, sex addictions. There's also workaholism, the addiction of they just can't stop. And that often comes from boarding school because we've got this thing called timetabling that Nick Duffel says. You go to boarding school from 7 o'clock in the morning till 9:30 at night. You are timetabled. You don't, I was talking to someone on a podcast a couple of days ago. He says that the average boarding school week is about 80 hours for a child. You've got an 80-hour week for a child, and the same for the teachers. And the thing they're currently struggling with is burnout. Like you said earlier about, having that softness. There's no softness there. So we're just like, go, 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 go. Now I see people in my work, the 20s and often the 30s, they're really productive. They do wonderful things because they've dissociated. They're just blah, 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 blah. But eventually they break out. They burn out. They can't go on because there's not, this ultradian rhythm of on and then off. It's just on all the time. So that's often what I see. And, when I go to the rest of Europe, I remember I was in Greece a couple of years ago for a holiday, sat in the airport, and there were workers just sat down, just chatting. And I was like, you would never see that in Britain. You're expected to always be on the go or you go home. And it was just really nice to see that kind of on and then off. What other things do I see? Relationship breakdown. Because there's no ability to connect to their emotions, they find it very difficult to be in relationship. As Jung said, it's projection. We project out that which we will not look at within ourselves, that we've dissociated, onto our partners. If we're in a position of leadership, we'll put that onto the people we're leading. That's why in the UK, I see there's a huge issue at the moment with vulnerability. And the people who are vulnerable, the old, or the children, or the infirm, because our leaders learn to hate the vulnerable inside themselves. And therefore they cannot, if they hate that within themselves, they'll project it out onto society. Jung said, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. And this is what I see. The other thing is emotion. Especially if we're in a position of leadership, Professor Antonio Damasio's work, he says you cannot make good decisions without emotional information. If you've dissociated from your emotions, which is the principal effect of boarding school, you go, and if you show anger, you're laughed at, you're called psycho. If you cry, you're called a wimp, and you're bullied. You learn to become dissociated. And so we struggle making decisions. And I see Britain is currently going through that at the moment, is that it's the consequence of really poor decisions for decades in this country, because people haven't been able to connect to their emotions. Empathy. What other things would I say that I see with people? I think those are most of them, feeling isolated as well. They feel they're on their own. Especially people who are in positions of leadership feel very isolated. There's no one they can really talk to. No one really understands them. So yeah, those are some of them, James.
So if somebody's going through this, how can they start to break the cycles?
Yeah, there's many ways. I mean, I have lots of podcasts. I've done 120 episodes, mainly around this subject of boarding school. So I think because it's complex PTSD, I feel you've got to be quite varied and complex in your healing. So cognitive, I would recommend reading, books like this, The Making of Them by Nick Duffel. This is another great one, Wounded Leaders by Nick Duffel. And there's Joy Shavarian's book as well, Boarding School Syndrome. So I think that's the cognitive side. Understand it. And I've interviewed all these people on my podcast. And it's to go, yeah, this is me, to understand. That's the first level. Second level would be join a group. I've stopped the men's group at the moment, but there's an organization called Seen and Heard, which one of my clients is part of. And it runs weekly check-in circles. So you can go as an ex-boarder and you can hear other people's stories. So I think that's important for us to realize we're not alone. That isolation, I break that down, meet other people, hear, oh my God, you went through the same thing. The other thing is one-to-one work. Whether it's a therapist or a coach, you find someone, a counselor, who understands about boarding school. And there's a website out there called boardingSchoolSurvivors.co.uk or .com, which is Nick Duffel's workshops and resource. And you can find a person trained in boarding school syndrome, and they will understand what you're going through. Some therapists, it's becoming more well known, but a lot don't necessarily understand that it's a trauma. Yes, not everyone is negatively impacted by the schools. I need to say that. And not everyone is traumatized, but everyone has to survive, as Nick Duffel says. We have to survive. We have to create a survival personality in order to survive in these institutions. And part of the work is to dismantle this survival personality.
So with regards to your documentary on boarding schools, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I wrote a book a number of years ago, and about my boarding school experience. It was rejected by the publisher, and I was like going back to the drawing board, starting to write again, edit it. And then I was talking to a couple of friends. One's a film producer, another is a director. And I just said, I want to make a film, I think. And we just talked about it. It's like, let's do it then. So this was about 3 years ago. So we just began by interviewing people, putting ideas down, kind of what could we do? Where could we film? So we started to film. And so what I see is, it's a bit like the idea is, there's my story, what I went through at boarding school. And then the next level is, well, who else has had these experiences? And so we did a retreat where we heard other people's stories at boarding schools. And then the next level is the leaders. Well, if these are the experiences of the people at boarding school, what are the leaders' experiences? And so we've interviewed experts. We spoke to Dr. Gabor Mate, spoken to Nick Duffel, Joyce Shavarian, Alex Renton, people who were very well known in this field. And then it's to ask, what's the impact on the rest of us? And so in the film, we've interviewed historian as well, S.I. Martin, who talks about slavery, how slavery and the boarding schools were linked as well. For example, one of the most well-known slavers in the UK went to my boarding school, and the money he got from the slave trade, he channeled into the boarding school. So it was like almost a direct link between slavery and these boarding schools. So we bring that in to the documentary. And then, looking at the path of healing as well. How do we transform? How do we move it from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth? How do we use this as our gift? And I think that's the key message I want to say. Sometimes we get locked in the poor me, the victim. It was terrible. We need to grieve. First way, there's 3 levels really. First is we're dissociated. We've got to start to awaken to what happened to us. Second level is grieve. We've got to grieve, go into that space, that liminal space, as Robert Moore talks about. The third level is then taking that gift, as Joseph Campbell says, back out into the world, the boon. What is the gift that I've learned by grieving, going in? What from that experience? So for me, I'm passionate about closing or converting all boarding schools into sixth form colleges, making it illegal to board under 16, because I think developmentally it's so damaging. And like I said, I've got 50 biographies here, some of the most well-known people. John Peel, he was raped at boarding school. Boris Johnson was beaten. There was sexual abuse going on in his boarding school. David Cameron, he lost a stone in weight and was beaten. Tony Blair was beaten at school and he ran away. He not only ran away, but he tried to leave the country, got on a plane, tried to leave the country. You realize there are dozens, if not hundreds of stories like this of very well-known people. Richard Branson, he tried to commit suicide at boarding school. He wrote a suicide note and he tried to walk off the cliff, but the teachers and the other pupils stopped him. It's like realizing, this is what happens and what can we do? So that's, some of my vision and the idea with it.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very informative. I'm kind of just so much going on in my head, just trying to take all this information in. But can you tell people out there, what is it that you exactly do?
What is it I exactly do?
So like what kind of the sessions, one-on-one sessions or group sessions?
Yeah, so I've stopped the group sessions at the moment, but the one-on-one work is, it's maybe 12 weeks. I will meet with someone. It might be longer, but it's, for me, creating a daily practice. It's one thing. Another is goals. very important, whether you've been through trauma or you're just wanting peak performances, to have a vision of where you're going. Next thing for me is emotional intelligence, developing that, and also mental resilience, creating that. Another aspect is that inner work, finding those early parts of ourselves, grieving, letting that go. I teach people about leadership, what makes a great leader, the importance of love in leadership, and purpose as well, the importance of purpose to improve our mental health and other such things. Essentially, and there's so many levels to this. I've just trained recently as a coach in more sexual healing. So, because so many of my clients have problems sexually, So, it's something I love doing. I've been, 2006 I started. So 19 years I've been doing it. I've probably done 4,000 or 5,000 sessions with people. And it's something I'm just passionate by. So I'm always learning and growing. So yeah, that's what I do. I'm going to start a course in the next few months, probably after the film has gone out, called The Compassionate Leader, which will be a 12-week course, and it will be, group coaching, but also going through 12 modules about, well, how do we develop, to be a compassionate leader, to be in high performance and be heart-centered as well. That's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Piers. It's been an absolutely very, very informative episode.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you for doing these podcasts and, the wonderful work you're doing. Thank you for that.
Thank you.